160 years ago. Jaken was unsure of how long he'd been trying to crawl after he had freed himself from the wreckage of his pod. He agonizingly inched across the tile floor, his efforts rewarded with cuts and scratches. Whatever had been the result of the use of his powers, he realized he was the only one in this room.
Help me.
He wasn't even sure his vocal cords were actually projecting sound. He was simply going off what his mind was desperate to receive. Jaken's vision blurred, and he nearly retched. A fresh sheet of sweat erupted on his already sticky skin.
Please, help me.
Jaken inched along, making his way towards the console, which looked rusted over. Just as his fingers pressed into the middle of the console's base, his body and senses gave way to unconsciousness. When he woke finally, he found himself clothed and in a chair.
Hello, my friend. I apologize for your state, but my worn body was not strong enough to carry you to a bed.
Jaken was unable to fully grasp the sight at first. The man who had helped pioneer the machine they used to turn the tide of the war was nearly unrecognizable. He was old.
You're shocked by my appearance, no doubt.
The man took a seat directly in front of his former leader.
It's been 40 years since we put you in that machine and changed the fate of this world.
40 years?
I have to say, you have come out of it quite unscathed. Your body hasn't aged a day through this regenerative process.
Regenerative process?
Jaken looked up at his friend, his face wrought with confusion, he felt.
What's happened? Tell me everything from the day I was sealed inside that pod.
Our plan was both a success and a horrible failure all at once.
Oscar smiled, looking past Jaken to some memory behind him.
We really did it. That day, we ended the world.
What?
We didn't even know we'd succeeded for nearly a week afterward. Then the first reports started to come in from shepherds, who could move great distances and observe the results. Do you notice anything strange about this room?
Strange. What do you...
Jaken's confusion was giving way to anger.
This room isn't lit by electricity.
And then it hit Jaken. It had escaped his notice earlier because of the disorientation, but it was clear as a fresh written note. There were no lights. It was all candles and a few small bowls containing orange glowing coals.
It's all gone, Jaken. Every shred of modern technology. Near as we can tell, anything that generated a magnetic field suddenly vanished.
No way. That can't be. Everything... You're telling me everything? Worldwide?
As I said, near as we can tell.
How?
Jaken was now fully alert.
Your body emits a form of particular radiation. I, of course, was able to isolate the type you used and insulate the machine to it. I mean, it wouldn't make sense to attempt to use your power if the machine facilitating its growth and projection was susceptible. However, we never accounted for your state of being.
Oscar paused to collect his thoughts.
As soon as the machine attached itself, you must have lost your precise control of the field we're generating. If you remember your control tests, your concentration was imprecise, but it was only used against desirable targets. We never imagined your control wasn't necessarily target-specific.
What are you talking about?
We thought you could control your powers exactly. Instead, we unleashed a bomb. The tanks were gone, but so were the pacemakers. Jets were gone, but so were the trucks that moved food. They didn't just stop working, Jaken. They disappeared.
Jaken's clarity was giving way to rage. This mistake was unbelievable. It had to be a dream. This couldn't be right. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. He wanted to puke. Jaken felt his breathing quicken as he began to panic.
This isn't how it was supposed to go.
He was struck with a feeling of dread.
How many are dead? What's the world like? What have I done?
Billions are dead. Without the means to transport food, soldiers, medicine, governments fell. Cities became unlivable. I've seen it all with my own eyes. My traveling companion that helped me document what had happened died, and it took almost 8 years to come back here.
Oscar pointed to a pile of books, papers, and other such items.
I've spent the last 5 years documenting all the things I saw, but fate had one more twist in store for me. You. When I unsealed the room with the pods, I walked to each paying my respects. One last time to the men and women who'd given their lives to try and save the shepherds from extinction. Yours was the last I came to. The Tekenstein still worked somewhat, and showed a faint sign of life. You can't imagine what that was like.
Oscar leaned forward.
And so, for the last little while, I've been making notations, making peace with my mistakes, and waiting to die, knowing there's no absolution for what I helped do. The truth, Jaken, is I want to say I'm sorry. Not for helping you, but for ensuring this is a burden you'll have to carry alone.
Tears fell down Oscar's face, and Jaken wanted to squirm, but his body was unresponsive.
I don't have any regrets despite my human heritage. I would help you again and again, because I believe this world would have killed off all the shepherds. If God does exist, your kind must be proof of that fact, undoubtedly. We humans have a ridiculous knack for killing God.
Jaken suddenly felt a wave of intense need wash over him. It coiled itself like a snake around his heart. The pressure built as he attempted to strain to hear Oscar's voice. The next thing Jaken knew, he had stood up, legs weak but somehow holding him up. The clothes he was wearing hung from him loosely enough that he could not feel them.
Kill him.
Oscar made no attempt to stand. He did make eye contact with Jaken, though, as he searched for the man's intentions. The feeling Jaken felt, the need he seemed unable to recognize, became clear as he looked down on his age-worn friend and confidant during the war. The feeling was now a small whisper of the same phrase playing over and over, beckoning him to kill his friend. He wanted to be angry at Oscar for getting it so wrong. He didn't want to kill him. The words continued to push into his mind. The force became so strong that Jaken's other senses stopped reacting to his surroundings. He was on autopilot. When his senses returned to him like a rekindled flame, he realized he had killed Oscar. Jaken had never killed anyone up close before. This was the first time doing it in such a personal fashion. He had shot a gun and killed some with his powers. He was trained for close combat, but Jaken had never done it, nor wanted to do it. Jaken took in the scene completely. Somehow he had stood behind Oscar and broken his neck for some reason. Oscar's body lay next to the chair he'd been seated in. Jaken sat down on the ground, his breath gone, and anxiety building. No one would know about this, but Jaken would. He had the urge to vomit like he usually did under intense stress, but this time the nausea subsided, giving way to a strange sense of grief in his chest. He was alone.
This is Diana Corona, and you're listening to Shepherd, Journey of the Time Walker.
The present. Ben slowly opened his eyes, pulling his consciousness back from the strain of a journey through time. The blue, featureless room in which he meditated within his mind was always a comfort after a strain like he'd just gone through. However, unlike most other times, he became suddenly aware he was being observed by a man behind him. The presence was so familiar, an interruption that his senses hadn't brought him out of his meditative state.
What are you doing here?
The man was wrapped in a dark brown robe, and had expressly said he would never reveal his identity, which was hidden behind a thick hood and metal mask. Benjamin had long since stopped caring about this man's identity anyway. This mysterious man had come to Benjamin in his dreams and helped him understand his powers. Ben never knew or asked how that was possible. How this man would know so much about his powers of time and travel, and reading timelines and even slowing time to a crawl. He had a strange sense of dread that this robed man was actually a version of himself from another timeline, but the absurdity of the paradox caused him to drop the idea nearly as soon as he'd thought of it.
I see you playing in the puddles of time like a child, trying to see the ripples and how they might change.
The man walked up from behind Ben, who was crossed legs, still in his meditative pose.
I've told you before that it is far too dangerous a power to use well, and the consequences for our universe are immeasurable.
Don't give me that.
How much did you go back and fix, and still not retrieve your mother?
Ben tensed. It had been 10 years ago when Ben was trying to undo his own demise. However, he'd only managed to ensure his mother's death. Ben didn't understand the potential risks of a time ripple. He didn't necessarily rewrite a whole world, but maybe a few timelines. People or events were undone or moved. In the past, to prove this mysterious man that he could influence events, he saved the life of a man who later raised a son, and then more ripples. And soon, a man had targeted his mother for assassination, and succeeded. He was broken for nearly a year. The depression that swept over him caused him to withdraw much of himself from his family. The man in front of Ben had spent months with him here, training, helping, teaching, but never revealing his true intentions. Benjamin Hain had had just about enough of the mysterious robe guy. Benjamin breathed deep.
It's coming soon. I'm at the end of my line.
Ben looked directly at his teacher, catching only the expressionless mask.
My death is in front of me, and yet it's not the death I can't accept. I can't leave Byron to face this alone. He got his arm ripped open in one of his first fights. He's not ready.
This isn't your concern.
It's my only concern.
Ben's look became hateful. He heard the man sigh, or at least he thought he had. The robed figure closed the distance until he was one stride away from Ben's crossed legs. Squatting down, he drew back his hood. Benjamin tensed and felt strange excitement as the hood figure began fumbling with a simple buckle around the back of his neck, and then one around his head.
We are so close.
He pulled the rest of the mask free.
You knowing how I'm connected to all this isn't going to...
The robed man's hands held the mask in place, and then Ben could see the flesh of the man's cheek. Then he saw hair, and then he saw the face.
Who are you?
The man in robes couldn't take in the expression on Ben's face, because it changed from one emotion to the next at a rapid pace, starting with confusion, moving to fear, and ending with betrayal. The man who was crouched in front of him looked exactly like his little brother Byron. It was definitely his white hair and purple eyes, but there were differences. He was older. He had a deep scar on his right cheek, and a full white beard complete with mustache.
I can see by your reaction that this is the right move.
And how's that?
Now, you didn't kill me.
The man sat back and then crossed his legs to mirror Ben's posture. The smile was still plastered on this man's face. Ben found it disingenuous at best.
Your look of confusion won't get any better. I can only tell you that I am called the First. Yes, I know what my features resemble, but I can assure you that I am not your brother Byron. I am just part of his lineage. The truth is...
The man sitting in front of Ben now had his full attention. This older doppelganger stopped to think, and Ben tried to use the moment to wrap his head around this revelation.
The truth is, I was after your brother, but my method of communication brought you to me instead. Good that it did, as you were so lost and weakened by fear. I didn't have to face your mind as an obstacle. The other thing was, your brother was too young when I appeared to you for the first time. I know this is hard to accept, Ben.
You haven't even a limited capacity to understand the weight of what I've carried since he was born.
What I understand from you is irrelevant. Only the result and even flow of this timeline.
Why does this matter so much?
Without Byron, let me show you this world's destiny.
Ben watched as the man stood, raised his hands, the cuff of his robes hanging loose. Then, slowly, he watched as the room changed color from blue to a night sky. No? To space, Ben corrected, and then the floor changed to a brownish gray rock. The sun that still remained no longer was obscured by an atmosphere.
Ben knew where they were, despite the pang of disbelief.
This is Earth, isn't it?
Yes, it is. I am the First, and it's my goal to stop this. I'm sorry, but I can't afford to overwhelm you with all this. I need you to protect Byron and trust me.
I would always protect Byron.
Ben heard the exhaustion in the man's voice.
It's also why you won't trust me about his future.
Would you?
Perhaps not.
Several moments passed before the First spoke again.
Whatever you changed, you have to put it back.
Sure, I'll get myself right on that.
I'm absolutely serious about this. Go back and fix it.
A short pause fell between them. Then the First turned away from Ben and looked back at the barren world that surrounded them.
But before you go, I will offer you one piece of knowledge I have kept about your brother's future. You see, you think his battle with Jaken is the end of his journey. It isn't. It's the beginning.
160 years ago. Jaken suddenly felt a wave of intense need wash over him. It wrapped itself like a coiled snake around his heart. The pressure built as he attempted to strain to hear Oscar's voice. The next thing Jaken knew, he had stood up, legs weak but somehow holding him up. The clothes he was wearing hung from him loosely enough that he couldn't feel them. Oscar made no attempt to stand. He did make eye contact with Jaken, though, as he searched for the man's intentions. The feeling Jaken felt, the need he seemed unable to recognize, became clear as he looked down on his age-worn friend and confidant during the war.
Kill him.
However, as soon as the words manifest as thought, they vanished. Jaken had no idea where the sudden compulsion had come from, and he shook his head as if to physically discard the thought. He returned to his chair, lost in confusion.
This is R.C. Anthus, and you're listening to Shepherd, Journey of the Time Walker.
Varek sat with Byron on the side of his hospital bed. He had finally revealed everything to the young prince.
I begged Jaken to help me, heal me, but he refused. He sent me off in search of your father when I refused to stay by his side, convincing me that William was the only one that might help me. I, of course, being desperate, completely ignored the fact that he was aiming me like a weapon at his conquering enemy, but I was just so desperate to make it all stop.
Wait a minute. Let's go back. You said you're a twisted human, but you said they're drones. Why are you different?
Jaken had spent nearly a century trying to fix the world in small increments after having destroyed all technology. He felt responsible, at least that's what I gather, feeling like he couldn't do enough to help. He tried to create more shepherds. The problem was, humans were not durable enough to use powers like these. Over a period of time, their bodies would deteriorate, and they would die. They tried many groups, him and 2 others I called Mom and Dad. I assumed they were scientists, but I was an orphan gathered in the second batch for tests. Children seemed to be the most responsive, or at least lasted longer in the alteration process.
Varek strained, then shifted and fidgeted his fingers until they looked like steeples in front of his mouth. Gathering his emotions, he settled his hands back into his lap.
The village we were in had been founded by Jaken. He was away when the people moved on the small 2-room shack where we lived. They'd seen the 2 scientists remove bodies from the shack. They were endorsed by Jaken. They probably never thought the people would question.
Varek was breathing more quickly, and he was trying to push the words out ahead of the panic that was washing over. 50 years ago. Jaken had come to the village to find a mob in front of a recently erected gallows. He didn't even question what was happening. He just reacted, pushing through the crowd and taking in his worst fear. His 2 confidants on this project were dead. Along with them were the children from the shack, hanging grotesquely, their lifeless bodies another failure. Forcing his way through the crowd to where the victims hung, he paused. He thought he heard the faint sound of air escaping from the smallest one. Inconceivable, but the boy was barely alive. His eyes were bloodshot, tongue swollen, his lips blue. With a single small pulse of his power, Jaken weakened the ropes and tore down the boy from his noose and desperately tried to relieve the pain.
Raleigh, it's all right. I'm here.
No! You must let the boy die!
Jaken ignored the mob as he cradled the small child in his arms. Another failure. Humans would never get it. They would fear shepherds no matter what Jaken did to show them their good intentions. He felt pain twisting in his chest. He listened to the sounds of life as he held Varek's body and pressed his ear to the boy's chest.
Leave him be. He must die.
Jaken's head snapped up in a hateful gaze that made the whole crowd freeze. He had the signs of life he was looking for, punctuated by the bruise on Varek's neck. Glaring at the crowd, Jaken never broke eye contact as he laid Varek carefully down on the platform of the gallows. Jaken closed his eyes and blew out his breath. It was happening again. Jaken's failures were following him like a curse. He figured he was just doomed to this cycle.
Was this you?
He pointed back towards the gallows.
Did you incite this?
Sir, they had to.
Jaken didn't allow him to finish. Without even meaning to, he had clasped the man violently by the throat, and his thumb pierced the flesh just above the man's Adam's apple. He slowly withdrew his thumb and stared at the dark red blood. Jaken closed his eyes and blew out his breath. The crowd was too shocked to move. It was happening again. Jaken's failures were following him like a curse. He figured he was just doomed to this cycle.
What gives you the right to pass judgment on children? Yet again, humans kill us, and I'm supposed to do nothing? They'll never want to not kill us.
What are you talking about?
Jaken didn't answer her. Instead, he continued to ramble on.
Every time. Every single time. Yes, every single time. Why?
Oh, he killed him!
Hey! Jaken didn't even react when a man shouted and spun him around, thrusting a dagger into his shoulder. The pain didn't even register, as Jaken was too angry to let his brain take it in. His angry expression froze the man from pushing the dagger in more than a third of the way into his shoulder. Jaken's opposite hand latched onto the man's wrist that wielded the dagger, fracturing it, and then forcing the dagger out by controlling the wrist.
Ah!
I think it's time I show you how much strength a shepherd has. You want to hang us like slaughtered hogs? Good luck.
Jaken felt the wound on his shoulder stitch itself closed. With both hands, he reached up to his attacker and snapped his neck. The rest of the crowd fled, but Jaken faced down the ones who decided to stay and challenge him.
Only 5 of you?
He'd meant for the words to sound insulting, but they carried much more venom than he had intended.
That's really a damn shame.
Jaken's features changed, from a face twisted in hate to an emotionless mask. Unfortunately for these humans, even if they all attacked at once, which he hoped they did, they had no chance. Jaken would hold nothing back. Jaken stood his ground, ready for the first strike, as a villager tried to face him down. Jaken dodged a flurry of attempted blows, and then saw an opening to strike back. Grabbing one of the man's launched fists, he pulled the man down, drawing his knee up into the man's chest, feeling several ribs crack. The second strike was a tackle attempt. Jaken accepted the attack, but as the man's arms wrapped around him, he unleashed a hard blow between the shoulder blades, and felt the ease as the spine broke and an impact spot formed through the man's shirt. As the second man fell to the ground, dead or paralyzed, Jaken couldn't tell. The next attack came from 2 villagers. They wielded short blades. Jaken focused. He knew these 2 well. A husband and wife team of mercenaries with a decade of combat experience. The husband attacked first, followed by the wife. Their attacks were well coordinated, but eventually, after avoiding slashes of their blades, their attack pattern was clear. Taking the blade hand of the wife as she swung, he kicked the husband aside with a blow to the gut, then forced the blade to the wife's throat and slit it.
No! You're a monster!
Jaken heard the husband wail, and then the realization hit that the man was equally as dead as his wife. He tried to get up, but the pain from Jaken's kick held him in place.
Monster?
Jaken's lips curled into a sinister smile.
I'm not the one hanging children. Think of it this way.
Jaken bent down to look the man in the face, stabbing the man through the chest with his wife's own blade.
At least, this way you won't be parted too long.
Jaken stood, turning to his final opponent, who was back near the gallows. Jaken still held the bloody short blade in his hand. The 5th man looked indecisive. He didn't have anything more than a small knife. Jaken watched the man squirm under his gaze, despite being almost 20 feet away, and then Jaken watched as the man made a mistake. He looked towards the gallows, and Varek's small form still on the platform. Then the man made another mistake by looking back at Jaken as if to signal his intent. As soon as the man made a single move, Jaken didn't hesitate. He threw the blade, stabbing the man in the lower left leg.
Oh my god!
Jaken closed the distance between him and the fallen man, marveled at his struggle as he crawled as though he might actually get away. The blood was gushing, which meant this guy would bleed out. Jaken saw no need to alleviate his suffering, and stepped by him and walked up the stairs to the platform. He knelt down and scooped up Raleigh in his arms and held him close.
Never again. I promise you, little one.
Present day.
With no desire to help fix the world, creating more shepherds through the process I had gone through made no sense. Jaken met up with the man known as the puppeteer, who had the power to manipulate minds, and Jaken realized he could build an army, though it was temporary. It made raising villages easier, but the process takes time. The people converted have their minds stripped away for weeks before they become husks for transformation.
Varek took a breath and thought for several moments.
I need to apologize to you, Byron. I know we've not been allies necessarily, and that isn't your fault. When your father couldn't help me, and your brother assigned me as your bodyguard, while William figured out some way to help, I was bitter against my situation, not you. Our conflict was my fault.
I understand.
Byron thought for a second, then looked at Varek beside him. Then he looked at his arm, which had nearly been ripped apart by the tree golem.
Can I ask you something, Varek?
Sure.
I'm not ready for this, am I?
Varek didn't need clarification. He knew what Byron was asking, and he thought for a moment, placing an arm around the boy's shoulder.
Byron, no one anywhere, no matter how much experience they have, is ever ready for war.
I need to train more. Could you help me?
I will where I can. You may want to talk to the young man, Tyrus Clade. He has a lot of combat experience, and Roan has weapons background. Elizabeth can help you with close combat. I'm more of a background guy.
Varek pulled his arm back to his side and stood up from the bed. He felt better, as if his weight had left him.
Why don't you get a bit more rest? Tomorrow is training day.
Varek directed Byron to lay back down as he pulled the covers over his charge. Byron was a bit embarrassed, but when he was tucked in, he smiled with a slight blush.
Bodyguard. More like mommy.
That's an insult to the beard kid.
With nothing further exchanged between them, Varek left the room, closing the door. Byron was able to sleep just a little bit more. Tomorrow was the day he started training to face a war that had spanned centuries.